Walter Hughes, a humble Vietnam veteran, boards a flight to visit his late wife's grave, clutching his cherished veteran cap. A cruel passenger in 14B publicly shames him for his appearance and cough, demanding he move to the back. Humiliated, Walter complies, feeling invisible. Unbeknownst to him, a flight attendant, outraged by the injustice, alerts the pilot. As Walter sits alone in seat 31F, the plane stops abruptly. Captain Rhodess, a retired Air Force veteran, emerges from the cockpit, ready to confront the cabin. What happens next will leave everyone speechless and redefine Walter's legacy forever. Subscribe now to celebrate courage and compassion. Share this story, find the heroes in your life, and let them know they matter. Your support keeps their legacies alive. Together, let's ensure no hero is forgotten. Walter Hughes sat quietly in the seat 14B, his hands folded in his lap, the worn fabric of his faded jacket brushing against the armrests of the narrow airplane seat. At 74, his silver hair was thinning, and his shoulders carried a slight stoop, the kind that comes from decades of carrying invisible burdens. His Vietnam veteran cap, embroidered with the words, "First in, last out, 1969, rested snugly on his head, its edges frayed from years of wear. To the other passengers, he was just an old man, unremarkable, blending into the hum of the airplane cabin. But Walter was far more than the sum of his weathered appearance. Beneath the surface of his quiet demeanor burned a lifetime of courage, sacrifice, and unspoken grief. 43 years ago, Walter had been a reconnaissance specialist in Vietnam, a member of an elite unit tasked with the impossible, slipping behind enemy lines to rescue soldiers stranded in hostile territory. For 6 grueling years, he navigated jungles thick with danger, armed with little more than a compass, a knife, and an unshakable resolve to bring every man home. They called him Ghost Walker, a nickname earned through his ability to move undetected through terrain that swallowed lesser men. He memorized routes that existed only in his mind, paths carved through dense foliage and enemy patrols, guiding 47 soldiers back to safety, 47 men who would see their families again, because Walter refused to leave anyone behind. Each mission had etched itself into his soul, each rescue a quiet victory he carried without fanfare. But the weight of those years lingered in his bones, in the way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. Now, in the cramped confines of the airplane, Walter was invisible again. The walls of his small Colorado apartment held no trace of his past heroics, no medals pinned to a display, no photographs of commendations, no evidence of the man who had once been a lifeline for so many. The only relic of his former life sat on his kitchen table, a single-frame letter in his late wife Margaret's delicate handwriting. "My dearest Walter," it began, "if the world ever forgets who you are, just remember, I never will. You saved so many sons that other mothers got to hold their boys again. That makes you my hero forever. Love, Margaret." Margaret had been his anchor, the one person who saw past the wrinkles and the silence to the man he had always been. When she passed away in 2012 after a long battle with cancer, a piece of Walter went with her. The world grew quieter, lonelier, without her gentle voice to remind him of his worth. Every week, Walter boarded the cheapest flight from Colorado to Florida, a pilgrimage to sit beside Margaret's grave. It was a ritual born of love and loss, the only place where he could still feel her presence. He would talk to her about his week, sharing mundane details, the weather, a kind cashier at the grocery store, the way the sunrise painted the mountains, because those conversations kept her alive in his heart. The Vietnam veteran cap he wore was more than an accessory. It was a sacred relic, a gift from his best friend, Tommy Rodriguez, a fellow soldier who never made it home. Tucked inside the cap's inner band was a small, carefully folded piece of paper, a copy of Tommy's final letter to his mother, entrusted to Walter in case the worst happened. Walter had delivered the original 43 years ago, standing on a stranger's porch, watching a mother's heart break as he handed her the words her son would never speak himself. The copy he carried now was a silent vow to never forget, a weight he bore as faithfully as he had once borne his duty. To the other passengers, Walter's cap and worn clothes marked him as insignificant, someone to be overlooked. The businessman in 14A, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard, barely glanced at him. The well-dressed woman in 14C, engrossed in her phone, didn't bother to acknowledge his existence. Walter didn't mind. He was used to being unseen. From his wallet, he pulled a small, creased photograph of Margaret in her wedding dress, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling with a joy that had once been his whole world. "Another week, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of the plane's engines. "Almost there." His heart ached with a familiar pang, a mix of love and longing that had become his constant companion. He had no idea that in mere moments, his quiet existence would be thrust into the spotlight, his dignity challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. The woman in 14C's voice sliced through the cabin like a blade. "This seat isn't for people who smell like that." Her words were sharp, dripping with disdain, and they landed like a blow. Every head in the cabin turned, eyes locking onto Walter. His weathered face flushed with shame, the kind that burns deep and leaves a mark. He clutched his cap instinctively, as if it could shield him from the weight of her judgment. The businessman in 14A paused his typing, his lips curling slightly, but he said nothing. No one did. The silence was deafening, a collective refusal to intervene. Walter bowed his head, his heart sinking as he felt the sting of being reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience. He had faced enemy fire, navigated jungles under the cover of darkness, carried the weight of men's lives on his shoulders. But this public humiliation, cut deeper than he could have imagined. He didn't smell, not in the way she implied. His clothes were old, yes, but clean, washed with care in his small apartment sink. The accusation wasn't about reality. It was about her need to assert power, to mark him as less. A flight attendant approached, her face a mask of professionalism, but her eyes were cold. "Sir, we have seats near the restrooms," she said, gesturing toward the back of the plane. The implication was clear. Move, be out of sight, be less of a problem. Walter's throat tightened, but he nodded, his movements slow, deliberate, as if to preserve what little dignity he had left. He began to gather his small bag, his hands trembling, not from age but from the weight of being dismissed. Inside, a storm of emotions churned. Humiliation, yes, but also a quiet anger, a flicker of the man who had once refused to leave anyone behind. He wondered what Margaret would say if she were here, how her gentle voice would cut through the cruelty with a single kind word. But Margaret wasn't here, and Walter felt more alone than ever. Then the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, firm and unyielding. "We're stopping this aircraft immediately." The cabin fell silent, a collective intake of breath as every passenger waited, unsure of what was coming. The captain stepped out from the cockpit, his presence commanding, his eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Walter. The old man's heart raced, uncertainty mingling with the shame that still lingered. He didn't know what to expect, but he braced himself, clutching his cap a little tighter. The entire plane held its breath, the tension thick, as if the world had paused to witness what would happen next. Walter Hughes, the ghost walker, the man who had saved 47 lives, sat quietly, unaware that his heroism, his story, and his unyielding spirit were about to become the center of a moment that would change everything. Walter Hughes sat in seat 14C, his weathered hands clutching a faded photograph of his late wife, Margaret. The edges of the picture were worn soft from years of being held, a quiet testament to a love that had endured through decades of struggle and sacrifice. His eyes, etched with the lines of a life spent in service, 47 lives saved, countless nights in jungles and foxholes, traced her smile, a beacon of warmth in his memory. He was a ghost walker, a man who had carried others out of darkness, but now on this crowded flight, he felt the weight of his own invisibility. A dry cough rattled up from his chest, unremarkable, the kind born from years of breathing damp jungle air, cigarette smoke, and the dust of forgotten battlefields. It was a small sound, but it shattered the sterile hum of the airplane cabin. The woman in 14B, her designer suit pristine, and her diamond ring glinting with the kind of wealth Walter could scarcely imagine, far more than his modest disability check could ever cover, whipped her head toward him, her face twisted into a mask of disgust, as though the mere sound of his cough was a personal affront. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and loud, slicing through the cabin's murmur like a blade. That's unsanitary. The words carried an accusation, as if Walter's very existence was an offense to her polished world. Every head within 6 rows turned, eyes locking onto him, their stares heavy with judgment. Walter's heart sank, a familiar ache of shame blooming in his chest. He pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, his voice soft and earnest. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Truly, I didn't mean to." But his apology only seemed to fuel her disdain. Her gaze swept over him, taking in the frayed cuffs of his jacket, the scuffed toes of his shoes, the calloused hands that had once pulled men from the jaws of death. Her expression hardened, lips curling as though she'd caught a whiff of something foul. "Flight attendant," she called, her hands shooting up with the imperiousness of someone summoning a servant. Her voice dripped with entitlement, and Walter felt the weight of her judgment like a physical blow. A young flight attendant hurried over, her blonde hair neatly pinned, her smile professional but strained, as if she were still learning to navigate the demands of passengers like the woman in 14B. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" she asked, her tone practiced, but tinged with unease. The woman in 14B pointed at Walter, her manicured finger jabbing the air, as though he were a piece of evidence in a trial. "This gentleman," she said, her voice laced with venom, "has some sort of hygiene issue. He's coughing, and frankly, he smells like he hasn't bathed in days." She paused, letting the words hang in the air for maximum effect, her eyes narrowing as she leaned back in her seat, distancing herself from the man she deemed unworthy of sharing her space. The accusation struck Walter like a fist to the gut. His face flushed, a hot wave of humiliation washing over him as the eyes of nearby passengers bore into him. He tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice came out as a cracked whisper. "Ma'am, he began, but the words faltered, lost in the rising tide of her performance. "Look at him," she continued, her voice growing louder, more theatrical, as if she were addressing an audience. "Those clothes, straight out of a thrift store, that ridiculous hat. He probably doesn't even have a proper ticket. Probably some charity case or homeless person who conned his way onto this plane." Her words were a whip, each one lashing at Walter's dignity, stripping away the pride he'd carried through years of service. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp suit glanced up from his phone, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Yeah, this isn't Greyhound, buddy," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The chuckle that followed was a knife in Walter's chest, a reminder of how far he'd fallen in the eyes of those around him. A mother in the next row turned her 2 young children away from him, her hands gentle but firm on their shoulders. "Don't stare, honey," she whispered to her daughter, her voice loud enough to carry. "It's not polite to look at people like that." The words, meant for her child, landed like another blow, reducing Walter to something less than human, a spectacle to be shielded from. The flight attendant's eyes flicked to Walter, her professional smile faltering into something colder, tinged with irritation. She was young, likely untouched by the kind of hardship Walter had known, the kind that left scars on the soul as much as the body. "Sir," she said, her voice laced with a forced politeness that did little to mask her discomfort, "we do have other seating available. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in one of our back rows near the restrooms. It might be more appropriate." The suggestion was a polite eviction, a way to sweep Walter out of sight, out of mind, to preserve the comfort of those who saw him as an inconvenience. Walter's hands trembled as he gripped his Vietnam veteran cap, the faded embroidery, a symbol of the man he'd once been. Proud, resolute, a savior to those who needed him. Now it felt like a mark of shame, evidence of his irrelevance in a world that had moved on without him. His heart pounded, a mix of anger and sorrow swirling in his chest. I have a paid ticket," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "I'm just trying to visit my wife's grave." The words were a plea, a quiet assertion of his humanity, but they fell on deaf ears. The woman in 14B scoffed, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "How sad," she said, her tone so exaggerated it bordered on cruelty. "But your personal problems don't give you the right to make the rest of us uncomfortable." Her words were a dismissal, a declaration that Walter's pain, his loss, his very existence, held no weight in her world. An elderly man in the row behind them spoke up, his voice gruff and impatient. "Young man, maybe you should just move. Some of us are trying to have a peaceful flight." The words stung, not because of their content, but because of the assumption that Walter, with his gray hair and weathered face, was somehow the younger man, diminished in the eyes of those who saw only his worn exterior. Walter's legs felt unsteady as he rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each step was an effort to hold on to the fragments of his dignity. He reached for his small carry-on bag, its canvas worn thin from years of travel, and as he did, his cap slipped from his trembling fingers. It fell to the floor, landing in the narrow space between the seats, a small but devastating loss. He bent down to retrieve it, his joints protesting, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. A teenager by the window snickered, leaning toward his friend. "Dude, that old guy's probably going to pass out. This is so awkward." The words were a casual cruelty, tossed out without thought, but they landed like stones in Walter's chest. No one moved to help him. No one asked if he was okay. No one offered even the smallest gesture of kindness. Walter's fingers closed around the cap, his knuckles white as he clutched it to his chest, as though it could shield him from the judgment surrounding him. As he straightened, he caught his reflection in the airplane window, a ghost of a man, old and alone, his eyes hollow with the realization that he was no longer the hero he'd once been. To them, he was nothing more than an inconvenience, a relic to be pushed aside. The flight attendant gestured toward the back of the plane, her impatience thinly veiled, and Walter felt the weight of his isolation settle deeper into his bones. Walter Hughes shuffled down the narrow aisle of the airplane, his small, worn bag slung over one shoulder, his Vietnam veteran cap gripped tightly in his trembling hands. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of every judgmental stare pressed down on his frail shoulders. The eyes of the other passengers followed him like spotlights, some flickering away in discomfort, others lingering with a cold, voyeuristic curiosity that fed on his humiliation. A businessman in a crisp suit leaned toward his colleague, his voice low but sharp enough for Walter to catch. "Airlines really need to do a better job screening people like that," he muttered, his words slicing through Walter's already fragile dignity. A woman in a tailored blazer tapped furiously on her phone, her manicured fingers betraying a gleeful urgency, no doubt broadcasting the scene to her group chat, turning Walter's shame into her moment of entertainment. A young boy, no older than 7, tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice piercingly innocent yet cutting. "Dad, why's that man so dirty?" The father's quick, "Shh, don't ask about people like that," was meant to hush, but it landed like a verdict. People like that. The phrase echoed in Walter's mind, each syllable a hammer striking at the core of who he was, as if his 47 years of service, the 47 soldiers he'd pulled from the jaws of death in Vietnam, the Purple Heart tucked away in his drawer at home, the love he'd poured into Margaret for decades, none of it mattered. Not now, not here. His faded jacket, his persistent cough, his weathered face, they were all the world saw, all they needed to reduce him to an inconvenience, a nuisance relegated to the back of the plane. When Walter finally reached seat 31F, nestled beside the lavatory, the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant assaulted his senses, mingling with the low, relentless hum of the plane's engines. He sank heavily into the seat, the springs creaking under his weight, and placed his cap carefully in his lap. His hands, rough and scarred from a lifetime of labor and sacrifice, were all he could bear to look at. They trembled slightly, not from age but from the ache of being unseen. For the first time in 43 years, Walter Hughes felt utterly invisible, a ghost among the living. The world had moved on, and he was no longer part of it. He was just an old man, out of place, out of time, reduced to a seat by the bathroom where the door's constant opening and closing would remind him of his place. But someone had seen, someone had noticed. A flight attendant, standing quietly in the galley, had watched the entire ordeal unfold. Walter's walk of shame, the whispers, the stares, the casual cruelty of strangers. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with a fury that wasn't disgust or annoyance, but something deeper, something righteous. He didn't turn away or busy himself with drink orders. Instead, he moved with purpose, his steps quick and deliberate, heading straight for the cockpit. Walter, oblivious to the fire brewing in the front of the plane, sat hunched in his seat, the bathroom door's rhythmic thud a mocking metronome. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, creased photograph of Margaret. Her smile, frozen in time, was both a comfort and a wound. Tears welled in his eyes, but he fought them back, his throat tight with grief and shame. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he whispered to the photo, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engines. "You always said I was your hero, but I don't feel like one. Not anymore. Not like this." The memory of Margaret's voice, her unwavering belief in him, clashed painfully with the reality of his situation. He could still hear her laughter, see the way her eyes lit up when he'd come home from the war, battered but unbroken. Now he felt broken in a way no metal could fix, invisible in a way no memory could undo. Suddenly, the plane's intercom crackled to life, jolting Walter from his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rhodess speaking," came a steady, commanding voice. "We are making an unscheduled stop on the tarmac. Please remain in your seats. We have an urgent matter to address." The plane slowed, then stopped entirely, the engine's hum softening to a low rumble. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder. "What's going on?" a man in a polo shirt grumbled, checking his watch. "Is it mechanical? I can't miss my connection." The woman from 14B, her arms crossed tightly, snapped, "This better not take long. I have a meeting in Miami." Her tone dripped with self-importance, as if her schedule outweighed whatever had caused the delay. But then, something extraordinary happened. The cockpit door swung open, and out stepped a man who commanded attention without effort. Captain Daniel Rhodess, United States Air Force, retired, carried himself with the unyielding posture of a soldier. His silver hair gleamed under the cabin lights, and his eyes, sharp, weathered by combat and loss, scanned the plane with purpose. This was no ordinary pilot. 23 years of service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, had shaped him into a man who understood sacrifice, who recognized honor in its rawest forms. Now a commercial pilot, he hadn't shed the weight of his past, nor the clarity it gave him. He didn't head toward first class or pause to address the murmuring passengers. His steps were measured, deliberate, carrying him straight to the back of the plane, straight to seat 31F. The cabin fell silent, every head turning to follow the captain's path. Walter, still clutching his cap, didn't notice at first, his gaze fixed on Margaret's photo, his heart heavy with the belief that he'd let her down. But the air shifted, the weight of attention pulling him from his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Rhodess standing before him, his presence filling the cramped space. The captain stood at attention, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable, yet profound. "Mr. Walter Hughes," he said, his voice resonating with a military clarity that silenced the cabin entirely. "I am Captain Daniel Rhodess, United States Air Force, retired. My flight attendant informed me of your presence on this aircraft." Walter's heart raced, a mix of confusion and fear gripping him. His hands tightened around his cap, his voice trembling as he stammered, "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong. I have a ticket. I was just—" His words faltered, the weight of the moment overwhelming. He braced himself, expecting reprimand, ejection, further humiliation. But Captain Rhodess raised a hand, his gesture gentle yet firm, cutting through Walter's panic. "Mr. Hughes," he said softly, his voice now carrying a warmth that contrasted with its earlier authority. 43 years ago, you saved the life of my father." The plane went dead silent, the weight of those words hanging in the air like a revelation. Walter's breath caught, his mind racing to understand, to connect the dots of a past he'd buried under decades of quiet survival. The passengers, the businessman, the woman from 14B, the child and his father. All of them were frozen, their earlier judgments now suspended in the face of something far greater than their assumptions. The air inside the airplane cabin felt heavy, thick with the hum of engines and the weight of unspoken stories. Walter Hughes sat quietly in his economy seat, his worn Vietnam veteran cap resting on his lap. His fingers traced the faded embroidery, a ritual born of habit, not pride. For years, that cap had been a reminder of a past he'd tried to bury, a past that clung to him like the jungle mud of Cambodia. At 78, Walter was just another face in the crowd, an old man with stooped shoulders and eyes that carried too many memories. But today, something shifted. Today, his story would rise from the ashes of silence. It began with a voice, steady and resonant, cutting through the cabin's murmurs. Captain Rhodess, the pilot, stood at the front, his uniform crisp, his posture commanding. His gaze locked onto Walter, and for a moment the older man felt exposed, as if the captain could see straight through the decades of pain he'd carried. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd seen the world's edges, "I'd like you to meet someone extraordinary." Walter's heart stuttered. He wasn't used to attention. He'd spent years fading into the background, avoiding the pitying glances, or worse, the scorn of those who didn't understand. The woman in seat 14B had been one of them. Earlier, she'd sneered when Walter's cap brushed her arm as he passed, muttering something about relics taking up space. Her words had stung, not because they were new, but because they echoed the doubts Walter had fought for years. Did his service matter? Had it ever? But now, Captain Rhodess was speaking, and his words were pulling Walter back to a time he'd tried to forget. "March 15th, 1971, the captain said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "My father, Staff Sergeant Michael Rhodess, 1st Cavalry Division, was part of a reconnaissance team ambushed near the Cambodian border. They were cut off, outgunned, and lost in hostile territory. For 3 days, my father survived with no food, no radio, and a bullet lodged in his leg. He thought he'd never see home again." Walter's breath caught. The memory hit him like a monsoon rain, vivid and unrelenting. He could almost feel the jungle's oppressive heat, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the weight of a wounded man slung across his shoulders. He'd been 24 then, lean and hardened by 6 years in Vietnam. They called him the Ghost Walker, a nickname born from his uncanny ability to slip through enemy lines, to find the lost, to bring them home. He'd never left anyone behind, not in the jungle, not in the chaos of war. But the war had left him behind, or so he'd thought. "You found him," Captain Rhodess continued, his voice growing stronger, as if drawing strength from the truth he was unveiling. "You, Walter Hughes, carried my father 8 miles through enemy territory. 8 miles of jungle crawling with danger. With a wounded man on your back and a target on yours. You got him to an extraction point. You saved his life." The captain paused, his eyes glistening. "And because you did, I'm standing here today. Without my father coming home, I wouldn't exist." Walter's hands trembled. He hadn't heard that name, Staff Sergeant Michael Rhodess, in decades. But the weight of that mission had never left him. He remembered the sergeant's fevered murmurs, the way he'd begged Walter to leave him behind so he could save himself. Walter had refused. He always refused. 47 soldiers had made it home because of him, each one a victory etched into his soul, but also a burden. The ones he'd saved had families, futures, children. But Walter, he'd come home to a country that didn't know what to do with him, to nightmares that never faded, to a life of quiet survival. The captain removed his pilot's cap, holding it at his side with a reverence that made Walter's chest tighten. "My father spoke of you until the day he died last year," Rhodess said softly. "He called you the Ghost Walker, the man who moved like a shadow to bring light to those who'd lost hope. He never forgot you, and neither will I." Tears spilled down Walter's weathered cheeks, carving paths through the lines of a face that had seen too much. These weren't the tears of shame that had haunted him for years, the ones that came when someone dismissed his service or when he woke from dreams of gunfire. These were tears of being seen, of knowing that his sacrifices hadn't vanished into the void. For the first time in decades, Walter felt the flicker of pride he'd thought was long dead. Captain Rhodess extended his hand, his expression earnest. "Sir, it would be my honor to escort you to first class. Please, allow me." The cabin fell silent, but the air buzzed with tension. The woman in 14B sat frozen, her face drained of color. Her earlier cruelty hung in the air like a bad smell, and now she looked small, her arrogance stripped away by the truth. Walter barely noticed her. His focus was on the captain, on the hand outstretched, not just in gratitude, but in recognition. But Rhodess wasn't done. He turned to the passengers, his voice taking on the edge of a man who'd earned his authority. "This man," he said, gesturing to Walter, "served 6 years in Vietnam. He went behind enemy lines time and again to rescue soldiers who thought they'd been forgotten. He brought 47 men home to their families, 47 lives saved, 47 futures made possible. This man has earned every comfort, every courtesy, and every ounce of respect we can give him. And anyone who thinks otherwise?" His gaze swept the cabin, lingering just a moment on 14B. "They don't deserve to breathe the same air he does." The silence that followed was profound, a collective holding of breath. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the plane, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the cabin erupted in applause, a thunderous wave of gratitude that shook Walter to his core. He'd spent years hiding from attention, but now he couldn't escape it. And for once, he didn't want to. A young soldier in row 18, still in his fatigues, snapped to attention and saluted. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, his voice thick with respect. Walter nodded, his throat too tight to respond. An elderly woman approached next, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "My brother served in Vietnam," she said, her eyes brimming. "He didn't come home. Thank you for bringing so many others back to their families." Her words were a knife and a balm, cutting into Walter's grief for the ones he couldn't save, but soothing the ache of being forgotten. A businessman who'd earlier mocked Walter's slow shuffle down the aisle now stood before him, his head bowed. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry," he said, his voice low. "I was out of line. Please forgive me." Walter looked into the man's eyes and saw genuine remorse. He nodded, not out of obligation, but because he understood the weight of mistakes. He'd carried his own for years. But the moment that broke him came from a small figure weaving through the aisle. A girl, no older than 7, approached with a shy smile, clutching a tiny American flag pin from her backpack. "My daddy says heroes keep us safe," she said, her voice clear and earnest. "Thank you for keeping us safe." She held out the pin, and Walter's heart cracked open. He knelt to her level, ignoring the ache in his knees, and took the pin with trembling hands. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Emma," she replied. "Well, Emma," Walter said, his eyes locked on hers, "heroes like your daddy are why old soldiers like me got to come home. You tell him I said thank you, okay?" She nodded solemnly, and Walter pinned the flag to his cap, right beside the faded Vietnam ribbon. It felt like a medal, one he hadn't known he needed. Captain Rhodess escorted Walter to seat 2A, a first-class window seat with extra leg room and a view of the endless sky. As Walter settled in, he placed his cap on his lap. But this time it wasn't a shield. It was a badge, a symbol of a life that mattered. The woman from 14B tried to approach, her face a mask of guilt. But Rhodess stopped her with a quiet, firm, "Ma'am, I think you've said enough for one flight." Walter didn't look back. He didn't need her apology. He had something better, his dignity, reclaimed at last. As the plane soared toward Miami, Walter gazed out at the clouds, their soft edges glowing in the sunlight. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost haunting his own life. He was Walter Hughes, the ghost walker, the man who never left anyone behind. And now someone had refused to leave him behind. The applause had faded, but its echo lingered in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt since the jungle. For the next 2 hours, Walter wasn't just a passenger. He was a hero, remembered and honored, his story woven into the lives of those he'd saved and those who'd never forget him. As the plane cut through the endless sky, Walter Hughes sat in a first-class seat that felt like a gift from another world. His Vietnam veteran cap, frayed at the edges but worn with quiet pride, rested on the tray table, a silent testament to a life forged in the crucible of duty. The drone of the engines blurred into the background as flight attendants, once aloof and dismissive, now hovered with a warmth that bordered on reverence. They tucked extra blankets around him, presented premium snacks with eager smiles, and checked on him with a tenderness that went beyond protocol. But it wasn't the gestures that pierced Walter's heart. It was their willingness to listen, to absorb stories he'd locked away for decades, Stories he thought had been buried under the weight of time. Sarah, a young flight attendant with a face framed by regret, approached him with hesitant steps. Her eyes, still rimmed with red from earlier tears, held a mix of guilt and awe. She'd been part of the crew that had overlooked Walter at the flight's outset, her indifference a small but sharp wound in the humiliation he'd endured. Now her voice trembled with a need to make things right. Walter, could you share something about the Ghostwalker missions? She asked, her words soft but urgent, as if his answer could bridge the gap between her shame and his sacrifice. Walter paused, his weathered hands still in his lap, as memories surged like ghosts from the suffocating jungles of Vietnam. The crackle of gunfire, the weight of a wounded soldier slung across his shoulders, the unspoken vow to bring every American home. "We called it bringing the boys home," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the echo of a promise kept. Didn't matter if they were awake or not, hurt or whole, officer or foot soldier. If they were one of ours, they were coming with me. His words wove a quiet spell, pulling others closer. Passengers who had barely noticed him earlier now gathered around his seat, their faces alight with curiosity and respect. An older man, his eyes sharp with memory, pushed through the crowd. "I'm Robert Chen," he said, his hand extended with a firmness that spoke of shared burdens. "Korean War vet. Brother, I know the sting of coming home to silence. Thank you for your service and for showing us what honor truly means." Walter clasped Robert's hand, feeling a bond that needed no words. For a fleeting moment, they were just two men who'd carried the same unspoken weight, who'd felt the world's gratitude slip away too soon. Robert's voice broke as he spoke, and Walter felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't anticipated this. Not the connection, not the respect, not the sudden realization that his sacrifices resonated with someone else's soul. But the moment that shattered Walter's heart came from a small, bright-eyed girl named Emma, the 7-year-old girl who'd earlier given him a tiny American flag pin with a gesture so pure it nearly unraveled him, now stood beside his seat, her small hand gripping her mother's. Her voice, small but unwavering, cut through the hum of the cabin. "Mr. Walter, my mommy wants to ask you something." Her mother, a woman whose face was streaked with tears, knelt beside the seat, her hands shaking as she spoke. "Sir, my husband's out there in Afghanistan right now. He's Army Special Forces, walking the same kind dangerous paths you did. I was hoping I could take a picture of you with Emma. I want to send it to him so he can see what a real hero looks like." Walter's breath hitched, his eyes misting over as he nodded, words failing him. "Sweetheart," he managed at last, "I'd be honored." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd never expected to be seen, let alone revered. The photo they took became a moment frozen in time, its impact echoing far beyond the plane's confines. Emma perched on Walter's lap, her small hands clutching a tiny flag while, as Walter held another, his veteran cap a steady presence in the frame. Shared thousands of times online, the image carried a caption that struck a universal chord. "This is what a hero looks like." For Walter, it was more than a picture. It was a lifeline, proof that his service, though long ignored, still held meaning. He thought of Emma's father, out there in the heat and chaos of Afghanistan, and sent a silent prayer for his courage, for a homecoming, for a welcome warmer than the one he'd known. A businessman in a pressed suit stepped forward next, his face carved with regret. "Sir, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "I was thoughtless earlier, and I'm sorry for it. My grandfather fought in World War II, and he'd be ashamed of me." Walter met his gaze, seeing not just the man, but the weight of his remorse. "Son," he said gently, "we all falter. What matters is rising again and doing right." The businessman nodded, his posture easing as if Walter's absolution had lifted a stone from his chest. The change rippled through the cabin. Parents who had once shushed their children, warning them not to stare at the old man in the faded cap, now led them forward. "This is Mr. Walter," a father said to his young son, his voice rich with pride. "He's the kind of man who kept us safe, who made our freedom possible." The boy, barely 5, looked up at Walter with eyes white as moons. "Are you like a superhero?" he asked, his voice brimming with awe. Walter chuckled, a deep, warm sound that softened the ache within. No, son, I'm just a soldier who did my job. The boy shook his head, unconvinced. That's what makes you a superhero, he insisted, his innocent conviction stirring something deep in Walter's soul. For a moment, he saw himself through the child's eyes, not as a forgotten soldier, but a hero whose story still held power. As the plane began its descent into Miami's glow, the cabin grew quiet. Captain Reynolds' voice came over the intercom, laced with a rare emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my deepest honor to fly with Mr. Walter Hughes today. This man represents the heart of America: courage, sacrifice, putting others first. Let's show him our thanks one more time. The applause that followed was a torrent, not just gratitude, but a heartfelt reckoning with a debt long unpaid. Walter felt it settle over him, not as pride, but as a balm for wounds he'd carried for 43 years. When the plane landed, something unprecedented unfolded. Instead of the usual rush for overhead bins and exits, every passenger stayed seated, their eyes fixed on Walter. As he stood, mattering his cap and the small flag pin, the cabin burst into a standing ovation. He walked down the aisle, the same path where he'd felt the sting of shame hours before, now met with moss, smiles, and hands reaching out in respect. Walter Hughes stepped off the plane, not just as a veteran, but as a man reclaimed by the nation he'd served, his heart brimming with a gratitude he hadn't known he'd been yearning for. Walter Hughes stepped onto the plane, his worn leather jacket creaking faintly with each movement, his weathered hands clutching a faded boarding pass. At 74, he carried himself with the quiet humility of a man who had seen too much to boast. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held memories of Vietnam, jungles thick with danger, the weight of a reconnaissance specialist's duty, and the faces of the 47 soldiers he'd saved. Yet, as he shuffled down the aisle, he felt invisible, a ghost of valor in a world that rarely paused to notice. In his heart, he still carried Margaret, his late wife, whose laughter once anchored him through the darkest nights. Her absence was a quiet ache, softened only by the thought of her pride in the man he had been. Walter settled into his seat, unaware that this flight would unravel his quiet existence, forcing him to confront both cruelty and kindness in ways he hadn't expected. The woman in 14B, a sharply dressed passenger with a pinched expression, glanced at Walter and saw only an old man in a threadbare cap. Her impatience simmered as he fumbled with his seatbelt, her thoughts spiraling into judgment. To her, he was a nuisance, a relic clogging the efficiency of her day. She didn't know his story, nor did she care to. Her cruelty wasn't born in that moment, but forged over years of small, selfish choices, opting for comfort over empathy, dismissing those who didn't fit her narrow view of worth. When she snapped at Walter, her voice cutting through the hum of the cabin, it wasn't just words. It was a dismissal of his entire existence. Walter's face burned with quiet shame, but he said nothing, his hands folding tightly in his lap. Inside, he wondered if this was all he was now, a forgotten man judged by the wrinkles on his face and the patches on his jacket. Sarah, the young flight attendant, watched the exchange from the galley, her initial impression of Walter mirroring the woman's disdain. His slow movements and outdated clothes marked him as unremarkable in her rushed, appearance-driven world. Yet as she caught the flicker of hurt in his eyes, something stirred within her, a pang of guilt, a question about who this man might be beneath his quiet exterior. Sarah's own life had been shaped by snap judgments, and she felt a creeping unease at how easily she dismissed him. She resolved to keep an eye on him, not yet knowing that Walter's story would soon reshape her understanding of courage. Across the aisle, Emma, a 7-year-old with wide, curious eyes, clutched an American flag pin her grandfather had given her. She saw Walter's faded veteran's cap and tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions about soldiers and heroes. To Emma, Walter wasn't invisible. He was a puzzle, a man who might hold stories like the ones her grandfather told. Her small heart swelled with an instinctual respect, untainted by the cynicism of adults. Later, when she shyly approached Walter and pressed the pin into his palm, her voice trembled with sincerity. "Thank you for being brave," she said, her words piercing Walter's guarded heart. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not as an old man, but as the hero he'd once been. His throat tightened, and he managed a nod, tucking the pin into his pocket like a treasure. Robert Chen, a Korean War veteran, seated a few rows back, recognized the quiet strength in Walter's posture. At 82, Robert knew the weight of unspoken sacrifice, the way heroism often faded into anonymity. His own memories of frostbitten nights and comrades lost resurfaced as he watched Walter endure the woman's cruelty. Robert's heart ached with solidarity, and when their eyes met later, a silent understanding passed between them. Robert wanted to tell Walter that he too had been misjudged, that he too carried scars no one saw. Their brief connection, unspoken but profound, reminded Robert that he wasn't alone in his quiet battles. Captain Daniel Rhodess, the pilot, stood at the cockpit door, his gaze sweeping the cabin. A retired Air Force officer, he carried the legacy of his father, Staff Sergeant Michael Rhodess, one of the men Walter had saved in Vietnam. When Daniel learned Walter was on board, perhaps through a quiet word from Sarah or a passenger's mention, his chest tightened with gratitude. To Daniel, Walter wasn't just a passenger. He was a living legend, a man whose courage had shaped his own life. Daniel's thoughts raced to his father's stories of that harrowing day, of Walter's steady hands and unyielding resolve. Without hesitation, Daniel decided to honor Walter, not for applause, but because honor demanded it. His voice, steady and warm, crackled over the intercom, recounting Walter's heroism to the entire plane. As he spoke, Daniel felt a surge of pride, not just for Walter, but for the values they both shared: duty, sacrifice, integrity. The cabin fell silent as Daniel's words sank in. Passengers turned to look at Walter, their faces shifting from indifference to awe. Sarah, now standing near the galley, felt tears prick her eyes. She saw Walter not as the frail man she'd dismissed, but as a pillar of strength, his humility a testament to his greatness. The woman in 14B shifted uncomfortably, her earlier cruelty exposed in the light of Walter's story. She avoided his gaze, her mind churning with a mix of shame and defensiveness. She wouldn't apologize. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But a seed of doubt took root, a question about the cost of her callousness. Walter, overwhelmed, stared at his hands, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He hadn't sought this recognition. He'd long accepted that his deeds belonged to the past. Yet, as applause rippled through the cabin, he felt Margaret's presence, her voice whispering that he'd always been enough. The pin from Emma, the nod from Robert, the honor from Daniel. They wove together, pulling him back from the edge of invisibility. For the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to believe that his life still mattered. As the plane descended, Walter remained the same man, same jacket, same hands, same quiet demeanor. But the eyes around him had changed. Passengers who'd ignored him now offered nods of respect. Sarah, her heart full, slipped him a handwritten note. "You're my hero." Even Emma's mother, moved by her daughter's gesture, smiled warmly at him. The woman in 14B stayed silent, her cruelty a stark contrast to the kindness unfolding around her. Walter stepped off the plane, the American flag pin glinting faintly in his pocket, a reminder that heroism doesn't fade, even if the world forgets to look. This story lingers because it reveals a truth we too often ignore. Heroes walk among us, hidden in plain sight. They sit in diners, wait at bus stops, live in modest homes where their medals gather dust. They don't announce their valor or demand recognition. They simply carry on, their sacrifices woven into the fabric of ordinary lives. The elderly man at the grocery store, the quiet woman on the subway, how many are like Walter, their stories buried beneath society's rush? The woman in 14B reminds us how easily we judge, how quickly we dismiss those who don't shine on the surface. But Daniel, Emma, Sarah, and Robert show us another way, one of compassion, curiosity, and respect. The children on that flight learned a lesson that will shape them forever. Heroes don't always look like the ones in movies. Sometimes they're the grandfather with a faded cap, the neighbor with a limp, the stranger whose eyes hold a lifetime of courage. Walter's story challenges us to pause, to look closer, to honor the invisible giants in our midst. Somewhere, another Walter Hughes sits alone, wondering if his sacrifices were forgotten. It's up to us to find him, to listen, to let him know he's not invisible. Because true honor doesn't need a spotlight, but it deserves to be seen.